From 1955 to 1975, America was fighting a war in Vietnam. It was a horrible fight. It was a brutal conflict that destroyed both sides. And it lasted nearly 20 years and went through 4 US presidents. But in April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace and the war suddenly ended. America lost the war. But the big question is why? The US had more boots on the ground. They had far superior firepower versus the North Vietnamese, and on paper, the enemy should be crushed easily, right? Now, a big reason why the US pulled out is because they lost popular support. People began demonstrating on the streets because the economy broke down. The Viet Cong had more resolve, and soldiers were dying. The Vietnam War cost nearly $1 trillion in today's dollars and countless lives. And the financial impacts didn't stop there. The war started a 13-year inflation hell for the US economy. During the first 10 years of the war, US inflation went from 1.5% to over 6%, and that's a 4 times increase, but that was only in the short term. If we look at inflation long term, it spiked up dramatically from under 3% to almost 15% in the 1970s. The Vietnam War was a big part of why the gold standard broke in 1971 and why there was stagflation in the late 1970s. And this is the exact situation that the West is finding itself with the war in Ukraine. Huge deficit spending is ballooning. Russia isn't breaking, and the West is getting tired of the conflict. They are getting weary because the longer the war drags out, the poorer their economies become. And it's becoming more evident than ever that economic pain is starting to break the West, and sooner or later, negotiations with Russia will begin. And during the recent NATO summit in Lithuania, we might be seeing unity starting to break in the West, and the optics there are very bad, but two events really stood out. Now, the first is NATO refusing to give Ukraine any time frame for joining the alliance. And we know that Ukraine joining NATO today, joining it now, is impossible because it would trigger Article 5. It will escalate the war even further because the alliance would be obligated to help. And that will probably lead to World War III, and defense spending will shoot through the roof, and gold will be at $3,000 an ounce easily. But by refusing to give a clear roadmap, it tells us that either the West wants to lengthen the war, or they want to use Ukraine's joining NATO as a bargaining chip when the time comes. It could be a situation where Putin and Biden, they sit down, and the neutrality of Ukraine is put on the negotiating table. And that is certainly a possibility that we can't ignore. But things got even spicier. There's a further break in unity with America and the UK, calling for more gratitude from Ukraine. They aren't happy about Zelensky's attitude. So here's the situation. Zelensky made a tweet complaining about NATO not making Ukraine a member. He is angry that there isn't a concrete plan to welcome the country into the alliance. According to him, Ukraine also deserves respect. Uncertainty is weakness. So it's very clear that Zelensky wants membership, and he's scolding NATO for being indecisive. And because of this, Washington and London, they aren't very happy. And it kind of makes sense, right? Collectively, the West has sent Ukraine over $100 billion in support so far, and that is an insane amount of money. Just the United States itself has sent over $76 billion in aid. Just the military support alone is at $46 billion. And that is more than the entire GDP of Iceland or Estonia. This is money from deficit spending that's making the Fed's inflation fight that much harder. So there is a cost to the money. It is an expensive cost. This is why the West wants more gratitude. They are giving Ukraine their own weapon stocks and funneling money at the expense of higher inflation. And here's what Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said. I think the American people do deserve a degree of gratitude from the United States government for their willingness to step up, and from the rest of the world as well. So the US is pissed off, and this tells us that war spending is affecting America. Maybe in a big way or maybe in a smaller way, but it is definitely significant enough for them to complain. Now here's why I believe war spending is crazy and why it will be a big factor in pushing for negotiations. And let's remember that multiple NATO countries are in an official recession today. And this includes Germany and the Netherlands, and now the UK is on the brink of a recession as well. Trying to continue war spending during a recession isn't a great idea. It creates problems that will snowball and snowball until it consumes their economies. Now the first is expanding fiscal deficits at higher interest rates. For example, Ukraine just won additional military aid worth $1.5 billion during the NATO summit. And the alliance is also hoping to pledge 500 million euros a year to Ukraine for the long term. The issue is, where will the money come from? For most countries, you have to come from deficit spending, which means borrowing money from investors. Now, that used to be fine in the good old days when interest rates were near zero, but things are very different today. Take a look at this chart and you'll quickly see the big problem. This shows us how high interest rates have risen over the past 2 years. The majority of the NATO countries have seen dramatic increases in their benchmark rates. The US Fed funds has gone from near 0 to 5%. Rates in the Eurozone has also gone from negative 0.5% to 3.5%. And in the UK, we have warnings that interest rates can reach 6 or even 7%. So any additional spending today, whether it's for Ukraine or to restock their own weapons, is going to cost a lot. And it'll snowball the interest payments until it eclipses other types of domestic spending. And if it gets bad enough, we could see all the spending eat into other entitlements and social programs. Either budget cuts will happen or you'll get inflated away by money printing. And either outcome is bad. Check this out. The EU offers Ukraine 50 billion euros through 2027. And of this, 17 billion is going to come in the form of free grants and the rest in the form of low interest loans. And this is basically the Marshall Plan 2.0 to rebuild Ukraine. But where's all this money going to come from? It's coming from borrowed money or deficit spending at a time when inflation is still sky high and while rates are going up. And let's observe the situation in the Eurozone. Inflation is coming down, that's for sure, but it is still at 5.5%, while interest rates are only at 3.5%. And to effectively bring down inflation, you need to jack interest rates above it. The ECB has to hike rates further. They have no choice. And this means war spending from the EU is going to get more expensive because the cost of borrowing is going to go up. And that is going to cause a ton of social issues that are already starting to explode. I think everyone knows that Europe is getting destabilized, and it's thanks to a weakening economy. We know that France just went through their second round of riots in less than 3 months, and this caused horrific damage to the French economy and over $1 billion worth of damages. But here's another breaking news that's just as important. The Dutch government has collapsed. And this came out of the blue, and it is a symptom of not just bad policies, but an economy that is falling apart fast. Now, the Netherlands is on the brink of a crash, with ING Bank forecasting a recession for the Dutch economy. We can see that GDP growth in the Netherlands is starting to turn negative. In Q1 2023, the Dutch economy contracted by 0.3%. Sure, it isn't a big country, but the Netherlands is a perfect example of how economic pain exposes other cracks in the system. If we look at the headlines, the main reason is a collapse after an immigration dispute, and here are the cliff notes. Basically, Mark Rutte's government wanted to restrict asylum seekers coming to the Netherlands. Things were bad before, but it went out of control since the Russia-Ukraine war started. In 2022, asylum seekers jumped by over a third to 47,000. And in 2023, this number is expected to reach 70,000 applications. And he knows that taking care of them will cost a ton of money. In fact, it is expected to be 3 billion euros more than originally expected. Now, he tried to cap the amount of refugees coming in, but the rest of his coalition government disagreed, so the whole government collapsed. Now, you have to think to yourself, if their economy was truly fine, then this wouldn't be much of a problem, but it isn't. Dutch inflation went well above 16% in October last year, and the cost of living is still out of control. Remember that this is the same country that earmarked 2.3 billion euros for Ukraine in 2023, and this is money that could have gone to the refugee crisis or the local Dutch people. So you can see the enormous cost the West is paying. It isn't just the dollar amount, it is the strain on deficit spending. It's making inflation worse and forcing central banks to hike rates even further. Even lawmakers in the United States are calling for an end to the endless war spending. They know this can't continue forever. According to a Republican, Congress should not authorize another penny for Ukraine. Ukraine is not the 51st state of the United States of America. So the voices are getting louder, and we might be reaching war fatigue very soon. Sure, the US and the EU, they aren't losing any soldiers to the war, but their economies are getting clobbered, they are getting hammered, and voters are becoming increasingly angry. But how is this conflict going to end? Even if NATO feels the economic pain, does that mean they will just pack up and go? Well, not really. Let's look at the clues around us. At the end of the NATO summit, the G7 had a joint declaration of support for Ukraine. And listen to this: we will stand with Ukraine as it defends itself against Russian aggression for as long as it takes. So support won't stop. But the big question is the degree of the support. They can't keep sending $100 billion every year to Zelensky forever. It's just not feasible, right? Now, I want us to be clear that the West still has an emergency fund they could always tap on to give Ukraine. And that is, of course, the frozen Russian assets. And in a joint statement, they reaffirmed that Russia's assets will remain immobilized until they pay for the damage done to Ukraine. And let's put the number to the amount. As it stands, around $58 billion of Russian oligarchs' assets and $100 billion of state assets have been frozen. And that is still a ton of money that can be used. So there will come a point in time when the West simply can't borrow anymore, and chances are they could utilize the Russian reserves. The Eurozone is already looking to invest Russia's money to raise cash for Ukraine. They basically want to be Russia's hedge fund manager, and here's the plan. The fund will invest those billions in short-term assets to generate a return. For example, money could be placed into Euro bonds for 2.6% yield annually. And this is quite a crafty move because it helps prop up the debt markets and helps suppress bond yields for the Eurozone as well. Now, this is what I believe will likely happen to the Russian reserves. The West is trapped. They can't directly confiscate Russian assets, and that will lead to another de-dollarization hell, right? They also can't keep borrowing money endlessly and continue deficit spending to support Ukraine. Now, inflation will ravage Europe and there will be more protests and riots. And that's why, at least to me, Russia won't see their reserves ever again. It is as good as gone. So, what is their end game? And this is where we need to sit back and think about the three stakeholders in this conflict. Then we can have an educated guess on how the conflict could actually end. The first, of course, is Russia. In 2022, their economy contracted by 2% and inflation went well above 15% at one point. They have been cut away from the dollar system, and the oil sanctions are also reducing their revenues. So if you're Putin, you just can't surrender and go home. You'll need to justify the war to your people. And the next stakeholder is the collective West. And by that I mean the G7, NATO, and Ukraine. They all share the same common objective, which is to drive Russia out. But they have also suffered incredibly. They have given over $100 billion to Ukraine, and the Eurozone has slipped into recession. There are riots on the streets in France, and even America wants gratitude from Zelensky, so they can't keep this spending intensity up either. But the final stakeholder is the key, and that is the military industrial complex, the war machine. Nearly $50 billion in security assistance came from America alone. And if you're the merchants of war, you don't want this conflict to end. It is an income stream for you. So this will likely continue as a forever war. And I think there will be a negotiated ceasefire at some point where Ukraine gets divided into two halves, just like North and South Korea. There will be likely a kind of demilitarized zone or special administrative zone. One side will be pro-West, while the other will be more towards Russia, just like East and West Germany in the past. And this means that the West and Putin would still technically be at war. This will allow Biden to tell the American people that the struggle isn't over. At the same time, Putin can say the exact same thing to the Russians. Both sides get to save face. And for the military-industrial complex, this will likely be a satisfactory outcome. The arms build-up here will continue and money will keep flowing to the military. There will be a constant demand for weapons and tons of money to be made in the long term, because the war technically isn't over yet. Now, fortunately, I don't see another way out of this conflict. Unless either side escalates further into something nuclear, this state of affairs can't continue forever. All this deficit spending will have to scale down, and a stalemate is likely the best possible outcome. And this could come as soon as next year, especially once a global recession hits. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Is the West finally feeling the economic pain? And what is the end game here? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.